It comes as absolutely no surprise that there is a lot of opinions throughout the Ninjago community, and of course some of them are quite commonly accepted and some of them aren't, and that is the concept of a hot take. And I have a series on this channel where I discuss hot takes, and I absolutely love going through these videos because you guys have more than delivered yet again. That comment section on the previous one was absolutely fantastic, and to be honest, I just sat there for hours just reading through all the comments. So thank you to everyone who has commented because they were all so interesting to read through. And honestly, I wish I could have done all of them, but as of now, I am just going to cover 6 of them today. And ultimately, if you have a hot take, leave it in the comment section down below, because I love these videos, and as long as you guys enjoy them, I will continue to do so. But let me not waste any more of your time, and let's start talking about some of these amazing hot takes. The first one comes from Passport the Lawkeeper, and honestly, I need an explanation on that name. But your hot take was that the OG Ninja team needed a significant redesign to show the passage of time. The scene where Lloyd goes to the memorial on the crossroad always stood out to me as odd, since he looks identical after all the time has passed since the merge. My assumption for not doing a redesign was to avoid controversy, lower costs, and allow returning viewers to recognize the characters. And then you asked how I would redesign them over the passage of time. Thank you very much, and also thank you for supporting the channel. And this honestly is an interesting one, and I kind of agree with it. So of course we all know that the passage of time has definitely been significant. Remember, the ninja look identical in season 8 in comparison to the most recent instance of Ninjago, which is season 3 part 1. But the fact is that over those multiple years, which canonically tells us that there is multi-year passings, has honestly been interesting to see, because they do maintain that original design like you said. Of course, there was a year between Seabound and Crystallized, there was a couple years between the merge itself and season 1 part 2 of Dragon's Rising. There has been a lot of instances of the passage of time, and I do think it's interesting that we never actually get any sort of development. But I do think you're right. It would be cool to see the ninja actually age up. It would be interesting just to see minor changes that have actually happened over the course of time. I mean, there's always been slight design changes in accordance with certain things. I mean, Krusty makes an amazing video that talks about how Lloyd and Nia's hair is actually shorter because of Dragon's Rising's new suit designs, and I think that's fascinating, to be honest with you, so check that out if you haven't. But there's little instances like that, but there's never a significant instance of redesign. And I think you're right. I do think, ultimately speaking, it is to avoid controversy, because to this day, there are still people who don't like the new redesign, and honestly, that's something I've been tempted to cover, but I don't know if I want to put my toe in that really bad pool. But the fact is that the designs are still kind of contested, but most people now just accept the designs for what they are. Also, like you said, lowering costs is a factor. It's a new show, new design, new lands. Of course, redesign the ninja may be a bit too much to do at that point in time, and like you said, ease of access for returning viewers. But I do agree with you. I do think it would be cool to get subtle changes, and that does lead to your question of how would you redesign them over the course of time. And honestly, there are small differences that I think could be interesting to actually see. For example, you could say maybe Cole's hair got longer, and that's where we get to see the buns look that we get to see in the island and also from the movie actually return, and have that as the standard Cole headpiece potentially. Or you could say maybe Lloyd's hair gets slightly longer, or maybe Lloyd's hair does a little more of a different style. Or you could say Kai, for example, maybe lets down his hair a little more. You could do these little instances that would make sense and ultimately would probably make it a little more interesting. I would say they've probably done it is with Rogue, because of course Rogue has officially grown out his hair, and I mean, it's interesting the implications of that, because ultimately, even though we don't know how much time it is between season 2 part 2 and season 3 part 1, we have to assume it's not long at all, because the Forbidden Five weren't just doing nothing. I mean, Raz and Aaron weren't also just sat there doing nothing, and Raz was still injured. I mean, it has to make sense that it's barely any time, and Jay's hair is just suddenly really long, which is weird in of itself. But at least he did get something, which is nice at the very least. But yeah, I do understand what you're coming from. Maybe even just changing the hairstyle. Maybe Nia gets a different hairstyle. Maybe someone gets something different here and there. Who knows? But like you said, it would be really nice if they actually did get something else. So ultimately, I do agree with you. I'd be very curious to see how other people would interpret their design over time. But yeah, overall, I 100% agree with you. Thank you very much for this comment. The second hot take comes from Reaching for the Sky. Hello, my friend. And also, nice simple names for once. Anyway, your hot take: the reason people dislike the 11-minute era isn't necessarily because the plots are bad, but because they have so much unused potential, especially the Ice Chapter, Prime Empire, and Crystallized. And honestly, again, you are completely right. Your example for the Ice Chapter, they delivered almost nothing of note for the ninja other than Lloyd addressing his trauma for Harumi, and giving Nia that weird ice subplot they never touched on again, and this is especially bad for Zane, given he was a villain for a few decades. And ultimately, yeah, these are perfect examples. The Ice Chapter does kind of want to set things up. I mean, the Nia Ice thing is fairly interesting and could have still been expanded on. She could have brought that information to Wu, and Wu could have helped her train further on it, and it could have been useful in future instances. And then you could look at it at the other way as well. We could have explored the concept of other ninjas tapping into kind of subsections of their elemental power. So yeah, this is massive waste of potential, and I'm not going to do my Zane rant again. Basically, look at any video where I talk about Zane or the Ice Emperor, and you will know my problem with him. And then, like you said, Lloyd randomly trauma dumping the Harumi stuff, it's okay for what it is, but ultimately, again, just kind of nothing, and the rest of the ninja really had nothing. You said for Prime Empire, it could have been one of the most interesting seasons, but for some reason they made it a clone of Skybound, even down to the ninja getting cubed in almost the same order they were wished away. Again, this is honestly kind of perfect. Also, you bring up a valid point of the ninja getting cubed in almost the same order. I believe the only outlier to this is that Cole goes before Zane, and even then, that's just because Zane wasn't even there. I mean, apart from that, you're basically correct. So that's actually a really weird detail I never picked up on. But the thing is that you are, again, completely correct. They made it a little too close to Skybound, and even though that's not the worst thing in the world, and they even cover the same themes, I do wish there was a little bit more. I mean, there is a somewhat rumor, I don't know if it was outright confirmed, that, of course, Prime Empire was meant to involve Jay's biological mother in some way. I mean, that would have been perfect, but other than that, you are right, Prime Empire really could have done more. And for Crystal, as you said, everyone's already made their complaints about it, but the biggest one for you is only Lloyd's lack of resolution, Harumi's new characterization, and everything with Nia. And again, perfect. Only Lloyd was subtly explained away online. I mean, we did get told by the writers that if Only Lloyd stayed around for at least a little bit longer, ultimately speaking, he would have become evil, and that's why we don't see him for much longer. I mean, I am okay with that explanation. I'm not mad at that explanation, but at the same time, we really could have used more, especially in the actual show itself. Show the consequences a bit more. And then Harumi's new characterization, I mean, I'm still due my part 2 on the Harumi video, but like you said, her new characterization is completely off, but again, I'm saving that for a video. And then like you said, everything with Nia shouldn't have been returned in episode 2. I think that was honestly one of the biggest issues that they had. They could have done what they did with Nia just later on in the first part of Crystallized, but yeah, even then, she came back and she basically had no consequence. She just kind of hijacks the Samurai X role, and then she just eventually gets her powers. But then, even worse, her whole thing with the mechanic is the mechanic says, oh, you're just the girl with no powers, you can't defeat me with no powers, and then she defeats him with powers, which is a whole nother thing, but we're going to ignore that for now. I mean, that's in my Nier analysis. But yeah, you are completely right with all of these. I do think you are correct. The 11-minute era, I think people look at not so fond because of the difference in writing. I mean, the 11-minute era just has weird filler episodes as well, which is another issue. But the fact is that you are completely right in the fact that people misconstrue bad plots or unused potential for the length of the episode, when ultimately some of the seasons had more time than some of the previous seasons before in the 22-minute era. So I agree with you 100%, and like you said, all your examples are perfect. Thank you very much, Reaching for the Sky. The third hot take comes from Darth Equalizer. Hello, my friend. And you said Season 6 is better because of its ending and makes the best season overall. I love how it really progresses Jay as a character and expands beyond his witty humor. And honestly, this is quite a hot take because Season 6 is quite hated, but I actually agree. I mean, I don't agree with the notion of Season 6 is bad because ultimately it was inconsequential because everyone forgets. I do think there is lasting effects from Skybound throughout the entirety of Ninjago. I mean, even when in Dragon's Rising a new Jin pops up, Nia is immediately suspicious, showing the effects of Skybound. I mean, it is a very valid and very real consequence of the season that people don't really acknowledge. I mean, to an extent then, saying the ending is what makes it better, I think is interesting to say. I mean, I really like the way back. But the fact is that at the same time, you have to consider the idea that potentially the whole reversal thing is kind of what makes it worse. Because even though there are still remaining consequences, the fact is that not all of the consequences are there. Also, Season 6 isn't my favourite season, or is not the best season overall. I don't know where it lands in my season ranking. I mean, I'm tempted to do a season ranking if you guys want it. But like I said, I agree with the idea that it progresses Jay and it expands him beyond because it's a very different Jay, and you could argue that it does make him different for the rest of the show. So, while I don't agree with the best season overall, I agree with the idea that it progresses, and I do think to an extent you could say the ending makes it better, but at the same time it does remove, I'd say, like half of the consequences. But yeah, this is an interesting one, honestly one that I'm still thinking about as I'm saying this, but yeah, I like this one, thank you very much. The fourth hot take comes from Skabubbles5090. I think I got that right, but I'm not sure. Hello, my friend. And your hot take is, the biggest reason people glaze Season 5 or Possession is because they hate Lloyd and just like seeing the OG4. And honestly, I see what you mean, but I do think it's a part of a bigger consequence. Of course, a lot of people prefer the show when they first started watching, and for example, I myself was around with the show literally when it premiered. The fact is that a lot of people do prefer that original team because you always think about the era where you started out. So if you started out when the show began, of course you're going to favour it. I mean, I do think there are people who do prefer just seeing the OG4, but I do think it's an interesting consequence because ultimately the OG4, just them specifically, you kind of only see for like the pilots in Season 1. And even then, Lloyd's in Season 1. So I don't think people glaze it because it's just the 4. I think people like the idea that it's the original from the pilots. But again, I do think it's a part of a bigger topic when it comes to nostalgia versus recency bias, and that actually does come up later in this video. But I understand what you mean. I do think a lot of people like Season 5 because of the dynamic with the 4, but I don't think it's because they necessarily hate Lloyd as a character. I just think people like seeing the core 4, and especially when we're now living in a time where the core 4 in their true good version, aka Rogue, it's been a while. So I do think a lot of people are just romanticizing that idea. But like I said, I really don't sit anywhere when it comes to the nostalgia, the new characters debate. But I do see your point, and this is one I want to hear people's opinion on. So thank you, Skabubbles. The fifth one is actually coming from Simon637. Hello, my friend. And I realized I've unintentionally taken on a theme because this is also about Oni Lloyd, but in different vein. And your one is, I love the fact we didn't see more of Oni Lloyd's form. Crystallize explored Lloyd's anger and guilt, and seeing him evade his Oni form was really interesting direction that I wouldn't expect Ninjago to explore. And this is definitely the other side of the spectrum because like I said before, we were talking about how we didn't get a lot of Oni Lloyd, but even though I do think Oni Lloyd is interesting, I do agree with what you're saying as well. Like I said before, I would have liked to have seen the consequence explored a little bit more, and that's specifically of the Oni form. We don't get it outright said that Lloyd being in Oni form in show was going to make him evil. It was something added on after the fact. But like I said as well, I do think the amount of screen time he actually got was fine for the most part. But like you said as well, they explored Lloyd's anger and his guilt, and the evasion of Oni form I do think is interesting, because even in that angry form he does stop himself. So I do think there's an argument that the lack of Oni form is a good thing, like you're saying, and like you said, it's an interesting avenue for Ninjago to explore. But I do think a lot of people's wants for more Oni Lloyd does come from a place of it's a cool, interesting thing that could have been explored. But like I said, they just simply didn't really want to, and it could have been explained much better in the show itself. We could have had Lloyd potentially explaining how he felt when he was actually in Oni form. We could have had Lloyd explore that concept a bit more after the fact, but ultimately he didn't. So it's a shame. But like you said, they explored it before the fact, so it's not the worst thing in the world. And I do think ultimately the amount of screen time is fine for what it is. But again, this is interesting to see the other side of it, because we covered someone who wanted more and someone who wanted less. So it's an interesting case. We got both sides of the argument now. So this is where I'm also going to ask you guys, did you want more Oni Lloyd? Did you not? And which one do you actually agree with? I'm leaning more towards Simon here, but that's not to say the other one's bad. But thank you very much. And the last one comes from Maze_3. Hello, my friend. And you said the recency bias is as bad as nostalgia merchants in the Ninjago community. Dragon's Rising gets completely glazed and said to be absolutely perfect, while it has many flaws. And this is where I'm going to have to talk about the community a little more. Because I've always said that one of the best parts of Ninjago is the community, and I do stand by that. But the fact is that, like you said, there are people who hate on other people because, say, they don't like the earlier seasons, or they don't like the later seasons. I think ultimately, if you're not too far in either of these directions of recency bias or nostalgia, I do think that's the best place to sit. If you just appreciate the show for what it is, and not have an ingrown hatred for either or, simply because of the time frame it released, I do think it's ultimately better. But at the same time, everyone's also entitled to their own opinion, and I think that is the joy of what we get to enjoy as well, because ultimately we all still love the exact same show, and I think that's the thing we always have to remember. But I do also understand what you're saying, because there are people who think Dragon's Rising is completely perfect, and even though I love Dragon's Rising, I can acknowledge the flaws. But the thing is, I can also acknowledge the flaws of the older seasons as well, and I do think that's the best place to sit. So I do understand what you're saying, recency versus nostalgia. I do think being too much into either or can ultimately just lead to toxicity, which is something that is just not really the best. I mean, can we all just enjoy the show? I think that's just the best idea that we can take from it. But like I said, the community is still one of the better parts of Ninjago, but that is because ultimately you do get to see the good parts of it as well. Like you guys. Yeah! But yeah, thank you very much, Maze. This is an interesting one, and I think one a lot of people will want to talk about. But those are the hot takes I picked for today, and of course we've covered a couple of topics. I mean, we've talked about the community, we've talked about Oni Lloyd, and we've talked about some other aspects as well. But I do think there are some really interesting topics in here that I would love to see your guys' opinion about. But like I said, thank you to everyone who has commented, and everyone who didn't make it into the video, because there were so many. There were so many where people had multiple takes. There was one guy in the comment section, which I recommend you look at, he had like 10. That was an amazing one to read through. But ultimately, like I said, if you have any hot takes, please feel free to leave them in this comment section below. And if you guys want it, I will definitely do another one, because these were amazing and I think causes a lot of interest in discussion. But that is about it for today, you guys. Thank you very much for watching, and like I said, if you have a hot take or if you want to comment on what we talked about today, please feel free, because I think the discussions that come from this is absolutely amazing. But the only thing, please don't be negative towards each other. Being nice is a great thing. Ninjago as a show promotes being good and being kind, and that is ultimately what we should take from the show. But like I said, that is about it for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and take care. Okay,